Jerry mentioned that there's not a whole lot of proof that even if global warming is happening, that there will be the kind of damage done to the earth that some people are talking about, like the increased storms, the drought, the damage to agriculture. So what do you say about that? Is there real evidence that those kind of major damages to the planet, to these different industries, is there any proof that that will happen?
Well, there can't be proof of things that haven't happened yet, first of all. So you can't prove in any conclusive way that something is going to happen or not happen in the future. So the demand for proof is a red herring. There is, however, evidence, and I think we should take these predictions seriously. Now, I'm not all doom and gloom. I think that human beings are infinitely adaptable and the environment is infinitely resilient. The question is not, the end of the world. The question is, how much damage are we going to let it do to ourselves? Really, it's more a question of self-interest, because the economic consequences of doing nothing about global warming are widely predicted to be worse than the economic consequences of trying to reduce our carbon emissions now. Not only that, but many of the schemes for reducing our carbon emissions will actually save us money right now and save us more than they would cost, because we're talking about efficiency here. And until the climate change debate ever came up, efficiency was not a bad word in anybody's vocabulary. But what we're talking about is, yes, you spend money up front to make things more efficient, but then you don't have to buy oil from these countries overseas. You don't have to buy coal. You don't have to buy gasoline, just because you're simply using less energy, period. And the savings from that have been widely shown to offset the costs of reducing carbon emissions, to make it as a net gain for the economy. Now, a lot of the stuff that Jerry said earlier, I would have to respectfully disagree with, that there is evidence that the last several years have been warmer. There is evidence of global warming at lower latitudes, such as the retreat of glaciers in the Rocky Mountains and the Andes and places in Europe. The fact is that these glaciers, a lot of them, in a lot of cases, are almost gone. And 90% of the world's glaciers have spent the last 100 years retreating, not growing. 10% have been growing, 90% have been retreating. And when you see the photographs of how rapidly this is happening, which is, they did do predictions on how rapidly the glaciers would retreat starting about 20 years ago. And the truth is that the glaciers have retreated even more rapidly than they were predicted to in a lot of cases, the vast majority of cases. So there's definitely evidence that global warming is happening at the lower latitudes, not just the poles. There are predictive models that show the Arctic Ocean completely without ice within the next few decades. Antarctica will probably never melt, because Antarctica is a land mass and land heats up much slower than, well, not much slower, I shouldn't say that. Water, the oceans contain more heat, just because of the physical nature of water, than the land masses do. So there's a lot of evidence that there has been warming, both within the last 100, 150, 200 years, basically ever since the Industrial Revolution. We're talking from about 1750, the graphs start very slowly climbing. And then since about 1950, the end of World War II, when manufacturing really hugely boomed, and then they go up much more sharply.
Right, so we'll get to Jerry in a little bit, but I have this one question. You've talked about trying to reduce carbon emissions by producing energy in a more efficient way, and you can get a lot of the way to the carbon emissions goals just by doing that. But what about just the way that people live? Do you think that the modern suburban model of urban development and living that is dominates the United States right now, do you think that that can essentially remain intact while cutting the carbon emissions? Or will there have to be some kind of fundamental shift in the way people live their lives?
I don't think there will need to be necessarily a big fundamental shift. We need to get off of gas-powered automobiles, the internal combustion engine. We need to let that go. But the advances that they're making in electric vehicles are very promising. Everybody's talking about the Chevy Volt now, which looks very promising, but the truth is the GM had an electric vehicle in the early 90s that did better than the Chevy Volt is doing now, and they buried it. They didn't want to build it. So the technology exists to help us maintain our current lifestyle in a more efficient way.
Right. So Monica says that we can switch over to a more energy efficient world without incurring a huge economic cost, or at least the benefits will far outweigh the costs. So you disagree, and so what do you see as being the economic downside of trying to aggressively pursue these different technologies?
Well, I mean, let me just cover a couple of things. Glaciers have been retreating for over 100 years. There's actually been very little before 1970. Even the climate change protagonists don't claim there was significant anthropogenic global warming before about 1970, 1980. In fact, the 60s and 70s were a cold period. The glaciers were still retreating. The reason why the glaciers are retreating is they built up during the Little Ice Age, and it takes a long time for them to melt. And yeah, I mean, I've been up to Colorado. I've been to Glacier National Park. I've seen them going back, but they've been going back a long time. It's got very little to do with what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years. As far as the research, yeah, it would be true. It would be lovely if it were the way Monica claims. But look, I do research in this area, and the technology is just not there. It still takes more energy to make a solar cell than the solar cell will ever give you back. They're made out of silicon. Silicon's tough to, it takes a great deal of energy to produce refined silicon. And the thing has only got a certain a finite lifetime, and it's not very efficient. As far as changing people's, in general, these claims that efficiency can give rise can reduce our energy consumption by 60% are just specious, because if they could, the market would have done it already. I mean, basically, you can't. If we could build a 50 mile per hour car that anyone wanted to drive, then we would be building it and people would be driving it. The fact is that it's simply not there. We can make small efficiencies, but at the cost of other trade-offs. So if to reduce carbon emissions, you are talking about major lifestyle changes. And a lot of people in the conservative movement suspect that this really is more than the wish to essentially make people change their lives is a lot more than simply a worry about global warming. They basically think that there's essentially a moral argument that we're living the wrong sort of lifestyle. So I think this is very much an issue of control. That American people vote with their pocketbooks and with their feet, and they've chosen the sort of lifestyle that we have. Now, some of it is a function of the availability of cheap oil, and that people will obviously make lifestyle changes as oil gets to be more expensive. But you've got to respect people's choices to do what they want. So there is no, as I said, there's no. We can't magically wave a wand and reduce energy consumption. European countries, which have been, have had cap and trade for a number of years, which have been trying a lot harder than we have not been able to see these reductions. Europe is doing no better than we are. In fact,
Europe is meeting its goals.
Oh no, it's
under
not.
The Kyoto Protocol.
Absolutely,
yes, they are.
Absolutely, they
yes,
are
they
not.
Are.
Every single European economy is over its Kyoto promises. And Britain has basically reduced its carbon emissions last year because they're in a recession, but they couldn't do it until then. Let me just give you something. This is sort of an old fart kind of argument. In the early 70s, I was in college, and there was a report issued by a group called the Club of Rome. It was based on, believe it or not, computer modeling. And computer modeling wasn't terribly good in the 1970s. They were basically using computers that are about less powerful than your thermostat now. But they put in a bunch of differential equations, and they propagated these things. And they basically figured, well, we're screwed. It was a report actually produced by Danella and I think it's Daniel Meadows at MIT. And they basically said, well, okay, the first thing that's going to happen is world population's out of control. We're going to, the population explosion is going to basically starve the Earth. If that doesn't kill us, pollution is going to kill us. If that doesn't kill us, running out of energy will kill us. If that doesn't kill us, resource depletion will kill us. They showed all these lovely little graphs that basically peaked around 1978, just beyond the forecasting just beyond the period that they actually knew, and went up and then collapsed. And the prediction was we're all dead. So as I said, I think you should judge the environmental movement as a whole by the success of their past predictions. And the success of their past predictions has been absolutely zero.